Imagine reading curated opinion pieces that aim to help us better understand policy and politics from the people closest to it, or sometimes people who want to be far from it. We offer political insights without the limit of column inches. Introducing Quotes by Air Quotes Media, creators of the Herle, Burley, and Curse of Politics podcasts, where we bring politics from the inside out. And now with Quotes, you can read from contributors like Jim Coyle, Jim Stanford, and Kathleen Wynne, with more to come. Read Quotes at airquotesmedia.com/quotes.
Well, greetings, you happily miserable accursed. Welcome to the pod. If you're all watching this on YouTube, we have the political panel here in ways you're used to seeing them. Jordan Leichnitz is coming to us from the Canadian Nerve Center of the Frederick Ebert Stiff Tongue Foundation. Scott Reid is in his basement, surrounded by the ghosts of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And if you saw last week's show, sea monkeys. And as it always does, Kory Teneycke's Zoom Square could double as the cover of GQ. But something is clearly different with me today. I'm a Florida man today, taking a 4-day break from winter without, stealing a bunch of shit or engaging in any of the other illegal, irrational, or maniacal behaviors that normally come with that label. All right, here's the rundown today. We'll start with a breakdown of Justice Rollo's report on Trudeau's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. The verdict is appropriate, but what are the reverberations? That's a long word. What are the reverberations politically? Our cursed clipping is Bob Fife and Stephen Chase's Globe piece on CSIS documents showing how China intervened in the 2021 election campaign, mostly against conservative candidates rather than in favor of some candidates. And then in the wake of John Tory's official resignation last week, we'll take a deep dive into that topic. Resignations, good examples, bad examples, what are the considerations, and tell some stories from our past. And then it's Gordon Pinsent and our Hey Yous. Jordan, Scott, Kory, I'm in Florida, and you're not.
You've made good life choices.
Yeah, Florida man bites gator.
I'm feeling like the only person who hasn't actually been someplace sunny in the last while. I don't know about you, Scott, but
does he look like he's had any sun?
Yeah, as you can tell.
I come in two shades: pasty white and lobster red. Those are my two shades. But
I don't go anywhere. I'm just chained to my laptop. I just pound out boring words one after another.
Scott's like Woody Allen, who said, "I don't tan, I stroke."
I'm going ice fishing with my 5-year-old this afternoon.
Jeez.
Wow, to you.
Yeah.
Pulling me up some pickerel. My kids are, my family day is being spent without my family, which is just the way they like it. And
well, something for everybody there.
My kids are skating on Lake Superior, frozen Lake Superior all weekend, having a ball, playing hockey. And meanwhile, I was, sitting here in Toronto, typing on my laptop, drinking from my fridge, crying in my towel. But that's all coming to an end later.
Well, I'm absent family on this family day, but kind of stoked because my eldest son got into UT in philosophy at St. Knight's, so I'm very very happy about that.
Excellent,
awesome,
right?
Congratulations to him. All right,
sounds smart though.
Yeah, well, I don't know how many times I, go around town and somebody says, like, you know what, I really need a philosopher. And, and he's going to fill that void.
It's okay, Kory, we're ready to welcome him into the warm embrace of democratic socialism when he's ready.
There we go. Speaking of epistemological crises.
All right, let's fire it up. So, the judicial review about the invocation of the Emergencies Act was released on Friday. Judge Rollo found the use of the act to be appropriate. We've discussed this in the past, you guys, and I think we're all in agreement that everybody in Canada had made up their mind about the appropriateness or not of the use of the act already, and that anything that this inquiry said was really quite unlikely to change any minds. Do we still hold true to that, Scott? What, if anything, is the political impact of this report?
I mean, there's lots of political impact. There's certainly lots of impact for those in government and positions of authority to reflect on. but I don't think there's electoral impact. I don't think there's going to be something that affects somebody's fortunes. I do think just exactly the way that you phrased it, I'm not sure I agree with, though, in the sense that I think that if the justice had found that the use of the Emergencies Act was unjustified, I think that would have kicked off an interesting debate. I think it would have caused a certain percentage of people to rethink their position, to question their position. I think it would have forced Trudeau to answer questions. So there is an alternative universe, and I don't think the government had any idea which way this thing was going to land. I think they felt secure about the decision they'd taken, but I don't think they felt secure about what determination the justice would make, because he kind of has to stretch the literal statute in order to deem it to be appropriate, right? So anyway, no, I don't think there's a big fallout. Doug Ford took a punch in the head. It offends me personally, as somebody who's been involved in politics and government, that he fucked off, and then he fucked off again by not. He fucked off on Ottawa in the first place, and he fucked off on the commission by not testifying and being held accountable. I think if you're in government, you have to actually carry some water from certain times, even when you don't want to get anywhere near the river, and he didn't, and so that bugs me. But I don't think he's going to pay a political consequence for it, to be honest.
Jordan, what's your take?
Not dissimilar. I think the electoral impact is negligible of this. I mean, I might quibble with Scott. I feel like the Liberals were pretty sure about what the outcome was going to be. I think they were radiating confidence about what the conclusion was going to be on the report.
Because the judge is Trudeau's uncle?
Yeah, obviously.
That's right.
Very uncommon name here. Yeah. I saw, actually, I think it was CP had to put out a fact check on that today, which is
unbelievable. I bet you a lot of Canadians believe that, Jordan.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think
and
you're
will
right.
never be convinced otherwise.
Yeah. Which speaks to a larger problem that I think we're going to get to touch on, later today as well. But yeah, I mean, I think what was interesting for me was a couple of things. So Pierre Poilievre, I think, dodged a bullet here in terms of keeping his discipline and the discipline of the caucus and staying away from this. And they held that through to the end. And I think that will serve him well. For me, the biggest outcome of this is I think we should have a discussion about whether politicians should be able to ignore summons for things like this. Should Ford have been able to have had the option to decline to appear? I don't know. I think he should have been there. I think the fact that the provincial government was pretty much absent in this process isn't good.
Didn't that hurt them in the report, though? Wouldn't they have been better off? I mean, it feels to me like the judge was partially influenced by the fact that they wouldn't come and talk. They didn't even have any side of their story in the report.
Yeah, and I mean, listen, I think from a partisan political perspective, they made the right call in not coming, because it's better to leave that a question mark and maybe suggest that you were derelict in your duty rather than to come and confirm that, right? But I think, in terms of an outcome, when we look at, when this comes up again, whenever it does next, the level of breakdown that happened in communication and execution between the provincial and the federal government of Ontario was catastrophic, right? And I think that it begs the question, should he have been able to so easily sidestep scrutiny on that? So and that's a policy question, not a political one. But for me, I think that would be an interesting one to pursue.
Kory, you got a take?
Yeah, I think there was a casualty. It was Brenda Lucki. And I think the report is basically about a failure in policing. And you can talk about different levels of government vis-a-vis politics, whether it's the mayor of Ottawa, the prime minister, or the premier. And I think the big problem is that nobody who's in elected office can actually do anything short of declaring a state of emergency to encourage the police to actually enforce the law. I think the actual truth of this situation is that we didn't need the Emergencies Act. If the police enforce the law as it actually stands, but I also think we had to impose it. And I think the government was right to do so, because there's nothing that you can say to direct the police in this sort of weird environment that we're in right now, short of that extreme measure. And I actually think the report missed the mark by not talking about that more. But like if you were to go through the 2,000 pages, there's not a lot about politicians. There's a lot about police failures, and I think that's really the upshot of the whole thing.
Hey, Kory, let me stick with you for a second. The judge's report did compel Trudeau to come out and kind of apologize for some of the rhetorical flourishes he has employed on this over time. What do you think about that?
What did I think about it? I thought it was classy. I thought it was appropriate. I actually, we've talked about this a bunch of times. I think Trudeau was off his brand and off, who I think he is sort of framed himself as being throughout his political career, Mr. Sunny Ways, etc. The demonizing of the unvaccinated and things like that. It's not his brand. I think it's very unflattering. I think it's divisive. I think it's wrong. And, I think it's a positive thing. He was self-reflective and walked that back in I think, an appropriate way.
Mid to late March 2020. Ring any bells, Herle-Burleites? Or have you wiped it completely from memory? I doubt it. That was the period when, emotionally, practically, pretty much every aspect of life changed as a result of COVID-19. Or as we referred to it at the time, the novel coronavirus. Last week here, on behalf of our presenting sponsor, Telus, I introduced you to a thing called an EMOC, Telus's Emergency Management Operating Committee. EMOC is a hugely important part of their culture, and in the form of 60-plus Telus team members, a living, breathing example of their commitment to network resiliency and reliability. But let's get back to events at the end of March 2020. Lockdowns in place across the country, social distancing the new reality, as we all swerved around each other, maintaining our personal 6-foot force fields. And home became our workplace, our doctor's office, our movie theater, our school, our everything. The EMOC team was already on the case. Their mandate? When a large threat to safety and connectivity is imminent and critical resources required, they spring into action for rapid response and recovery. In the case of COVID's march across the globe, preparing for the way we'd all need technology to stay connected to loved ones and do just about everything from home. More home internet, more voice calls, more picture, video, and text messaging, virtual meetings and classes, seemingly 24/7. Telus technicians working around the clock to monitor and maintain capacity, staying ahead of the demand curve, as well as putting processes and protocols in place to keep team members and Canadians safe. The COVID-19 EMOC met for a record-setting 225 calls over 737 days. That doesn't count spin-off groups and simultaneous EMOCs that sprang up over that period to manage the most critical regional situations or simultaneous extreme weather events. Herle-Burleites, this story is so emblematic of Telus's commitment to resilience and reliability. Billion-dollar investments in technology and operations, combined with people going above and beyond to keep us connected when the stakes couldn't be higher.
There was a fascinating contrast.
Go ahead,
Well, there's a fascinating contrast, I think, and it's, it hasn't been commented on a lot, and I don't expect it will. It probably doesn't cause big ripples, but the contrast between Trudeau, the one sentence that sort of, pokes a stick at him in the report, and I think, he proactively owned it during the news, or as Kory said, and I thought that was wise. I thought rather than continue to fight that fight, and saying, I guess on reflection, I wish I had tempered my words and my tone. I thought that was, if nothing else, politically prudent and shrewd. But then I was puzzled. First, by the decision of Pierre Poilievre to hold a newser that day. I think in the morning, maybe Kory and I was definitely doing some media earlier in the morning, and I made the dumb prediction that Pierre Poilievre would keep a low profile all day because he didn't get implicated in the report and get hit. There's nothing there that was terribly startling. So why get involved? Why associate himself with that set of issues when he'd played such clear footsie with the convoy, guys, and celebrated their lawlessness almost at points. Always careful to say I'm not against, I'm against criminal behavior, but these people are deserved and justified. he came out and spoke, and he spoke in unremitting terms. Like there was, if Trudeau came out and said, okay, well, I want to acknowledge that maybe my rhetoric carried too far, Poilievre came out and said, you know what? People are driven into the fucking ground by Justin Trudeau, and this report just confirms that that's why. And there was, it was a really harsh, sharp edge, and I was puzzled by it. I was puzzled by it politically because I didn't really get why he needed to do that. I don't know why he would have taken that tone. He doesn't need to curry favor with that voter cohort any further, I don't think. And I thought that the mission now was to try to, expand his reach, expand his appeal. So I was puzzled by it. It felt, it makes me wonder if there's a political calculation that I don't understand. Like, is his grip and the ability to motivate those voters, is it slipping and they're worried about that? And so they feel they have to throw some red meat now and then, or alternatively, is this the kind of guy that can be walked into a right cross? Because there are some times in some issues where he just refuses to do what might be the politically prudent thing, and he will invite that conflict and controversy. And is that an opportunity for his opponents looking down the road, how you can kind of breadcrumb that guy into a box canyon and then they just bring the rocks down on top?
But wait a second, isn't that his brand? Isn't that sort of one of the things that inspired conservatives about him? He was done they're done apologizing. They're not going to apologize for shit anymore. They're just going to play offense.
Yeah, I guess. I thought it was more subtle thing than that, to be honest. I thought it was, I'm not going to flip flop. I'm not gonna promise you milk and then show up with almond milk. And I don't think that means you have to go around and pour milk all over people constantly. And that's how it feels like he conducts himself sometimes.
But honestly, Scott. Sorry, but honestly, Scott, I probably read a dozen stories on the report. And, in the final paragraph, there's Pierre Poilievre's comments. He basically sidestepped the whole thing. And I think the whole thing is like a giant wet firecracker. When a commission
I'm not
comes
quarreling
out
with that. I'm just questioning the decision. Yeah. That's all.
What's up, Jordan?
My wondering is the flip side of Scott's coin, which is, I maintain that he was I think Poilievre was still pretty disciplined on this. I also thought the press conference was a little weird, but as Kory said, not a lot came out of it. But is there a liberal war room? Anyone? Hello. Is there a pulse? This is the day that the report is coming out, and there was no visible push to remind anyone anywhere about Pierre Poilievre's long engagement with these folks, right? And it just continues to be baffling why these opportunities are being just left and let slide. At the most basic level, this would have been a day to remind the media about that story. And it appears that absolutely no move was made. And that I think tells us a little bit more about where the thinking is at within the Liberal team than anything else.
I thought that was smart. I think taking pass on this, which is basically what everyone did, is actually smart. No one's looking back at the pandemic. Nobody really wants to relitigate these issues, and letting it slide by is probably the right thing. And I think what the Liberal war room do, they sent Trudeau out to sort of recast himself a little bit as a bit contrite about some of the harsher language, which is not, going to mean anything to the people he was actually aiming that to. He's dead to them already. But for, female voters in the GTA who, don't like that sort of harsh, divisive language, that's who that was for. And I think it was smart for them to do it. But look, when an inquiry comes out and says, I agree with what, 75% of the Canadian public already agrees with, it's not really a news item, right? It's a big shrug of the shoulders, and so everyone moves on.
Let's stick with this, Jordan. To your point, so Scott referenced Poilievre's association with the protesters in Ottawa, and I think we've all seen pictures of him serving coffee and stuff like that to people. Didn't Judge Rollo throw him a bit of a lifeline by concluding that the vast majority of the people that were in Ottawa were real citizens who had a legitimate thing that they wanted to a legitimate point that they wanted to make and were there to be peaceful, and that there was, the bad apples that sort of ruined it. But that, for people that were characterizing the whole thing as a awful bunch of people, that's not what the judge concluded.
Yeah, but he also concluded that there was a real incredible threat to public safety there, So I think that, it's obviously not the job of the war room to take a charitable lens to these things. You need to go in and cherry pick what is useful. And I think what's useful there is the reminder that, that Poilievre was very comfortable with the extreme elements that were in that protest at the time, which was not unknown. I think anyone who was there on the ground at the time and the coverage really did recognize that there were a lot of different elements at play. And he still went out there and lent his name to it. So, that's, to me, that's a very fair and I still think likely beneficial case to make, because it goes to judgment, right? Like that's the real thing is, did Pierre Poilievre make a decision there to go out and court these sort of really radically populist, more extreme voters in a moment of a national security crisis? And I think that that's a very fair case to make. And my surprise that they would completely pass on it. This isn't obviously something you would ever put in your principal's mouth, right? This is why there are many ways to get things out of a war room, but none of those seem to have been used.
I agree with that. I agree with that. And I would even pick up on something Kory said to reinforce the logic there. Obviously, you don't want the Prime Minister saying it. The Prime Minister had one mission, that was to try to accept it, take a little haircut on the rhetoric issue and move forward. But you could have had your war room pounding away on a differentiated message. And particularly when you saw that Poilievre was going to insert himself in the news cycle, then you should have been thinking to yourself, well, he's just going to be the last paragraph in the story. What can we do to move him to, up? And so that he's the seventh graph in the story or the fourth. Is there anything we can do? Can we pound away on that? And I just think I continue to be puzzled, and we've mentioned here many, many, many times at the official Liberal Party reticence as a political machine, as an electoral machine, to take the boots to Poilievre. I don't know why they're not doing it.
Especially given that that's the only way they're going to win re-election.
Sure, but on what issue? Like, I actually going to say I think they were smart. I don't think this is the issue that you want to wedge on or go after Poilievre on. I think it's backwards looking. It splits the Liberal coalition just like it splits Conservative and the NDP and everyone else. Like,
what do you mean by that? Like, how does it split the Liberal coalition?
What do I mean by that? Because of the 25% of people who basically were anti-vax, skeptical about the pandemic, etc. They're not all conservatives. If you actually look at who they are, it's it's sort of an oddball coalition of sort of Max Bernier, libertarian PPC folks, but it's also half of the Green Party. As I like to call them, the placenta eaters, right? Like they're stay away from me with your pharmaceuticals, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also there's a cohort that's been, growing in the polling around this post-pandemic, which didn't like the rhetoric. And the people who didn't like the rhetoric and, the nasty divisive stuff of demonizing other people. And like, we can all think of people in our lives who, had unconventional views on pandemic measures, et cetera. They are in every party. This is not a great wedge issue. And, demonizing them is, I think, very off-brand for Trudeau. And I think it's very unappealing to a lot of voters within his coalition, particularly females. And I think, he's, I thought he was smart to sort of, placidly apologize and move back towards this normal brand. But this is not the issue for them to fight the election campaign on it. And while, I hear what you're saying about the need to, attack your opponent, et cetera, you got to be smart about what issues you do that on. And I don't think this is a particularly smart issue for them to go on. I think there's better issues.
So I'm about to do something that might seem a bit jarring to those of you who've listened to my smooth, eloquent delivery since the hurly-burly first burst into the sky of Canadian podcasting 6 years ago, forever improving our political discourse. I'm going to use a cliche. Clichés can be hackneyed, yes, but some make you think, like the following: fast, good, and cheap. Pick two. In other words, you can have fast and good, fast and cheap and good, good and fast, but you can never have fast and good and cheap. I would pause here and let you reflect on that, but we have to move things along here. Anyway, it's sort of an economic law of nature. It applies to all, including our sponsor, CN. And I was thinking about it this morning when I saw a new report on rail cargo rates. Yes, I read things like that. The report, published by a leading independent consulting firm, concluded that Canadian rates are the lowest among the major free market economies it studied, including the United States. The price of shipping cargo in Canada has grown far less quickly over the past 33 years than the price south of our border. As a result, shipping in Canada is on average 11% cheaper. And Canada's grain shippers, benefiting from economies of scale, scored even better prices, paying nearly 30% less than the average Canadian rate. So, relatively cheap service, and CN believes very good service, which leaves fast. Could it be faster? Well, the fact is the supply chain, elevators, trains, export terminals, truck fleets have a capacity. Only so much can move at once. To deploy another cliche, you can't stuff 10 pounds of oats into a 5-pound bag. Oats? Did I say oats? Well, whatever. My point is that moving cargo faster means laying more track, buying more trains, expanding truck fleets, and building more seaport terminals. All of which takes money. Like a lot of money. And time. Which brings us back to the fundamental choice. Fast, good, cheap. Like I said, pick two. So my last question for you folks is this, and it's really more a question about the environment in which politics is conducted now than it is about this specific issue. And that is, we've had a judicial inquiry. A judge has made a determination and established what he thinks the facts of the case are. Does that in any way provide guardrails for how any of the parties talk about this going forward now or in an election campaign? Has he established a fact base that everybody has to adhere to, or is his report largely irrelevant to what people will say about this politically going forward?
No one's going to talk about this in the next campaign. It's in no one's interest to relitigate the pandemic, is my view.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be a big issue. I do think war rooms are going to engage with some of the things that happened during that period where it's useful to them, where it goes to character on Poilievre and on Trudeau. I think you're going to see it on both sides, but I don't think it's going to be a headline issue.
I think you're going to see conservative war room, and not just their war room, but also Poilievre himself will make reference occasionally to this as part of his overall thesis that Justin Trudeau is bad and divisive. And he'll say even, the justice concluded that, and Trudeau admitted and apologized for it. So he realizes it. So I think you will see that has a legacy as a talking point. That's not to say that the convoy will be an electoral issue in the next campaign, but I think that in the same way that Poilievre says, I was the only one who was right about inflation and I called those fuckers at the bank out, he'll make reference to this to say, see, the takeaway from that whole commission was that I was right and Trudeau was a divisive bastard.
All right. So as far as I'm concerned, there was a bigger bombshell last week because I think this is a pretty big issue. And it's our clipping of the week, and it comes from Bob Fife and Stephen Chase in the Globe and Mail, and it was a front page blast in the Globe about Chinese government interference in the last Canadian election. Here's a brief snippet from that article. China employed a sophisticated strategy to disrupt Canada's democracy in the 2021 federal election campaign as Chinese diplomats and their proxies backed the re-election of Justin Trudeau's Liberals, but only to another minority government, and worked to defeat conservative politicians considered to be unfriendly to Beijing. The full extent of the Chinese interference operation is laid bare in both secret and top secret Canadian Security Intelligence Service documents reviewed by the Globe and Mail that cover the period before and after the September 2021 election. Drawn from a series of CSIS intelligence gathering operations, the documents illustrate how an orchestrated machine was operating in Canada with two primary aims: ensure that a minority Liberal government was returned in 2021 and that certain Conservative candidates identified by China were defeated. Kory, what was your reaction when you read that story?
Well, not hugely surprised. Like, I also don't think it's new. We've had interference in elections from foreign powers all the time, and here's the ugly truth.
Really? Like, sorry, don't just run that. I'm so naive. Don't just blow that by me. What do you mean by that?
What do I mean by that? Like, you can go back to the Cold War. A lot of the anti-nuclear movement was paid for by the Russians. Like, this is all sort of out there and known. But global powers interfere in each other's elections all the time. And here's the ugly truth: we do it too. We all have horses in these various races, but I don't think the PRC's choices is the Liberals particularly. I think it's an anti-democratic, try to sow chaos sort of effort, right? Much as Russia's is. And, look, we engage in the elections of other countries as well. Like, it's all bad. We shouldn't do it. They shouldn't do it. But I'm not shocked by any of it. Is anyone actually surprised? Like, I just think it's completely unsurprising.
I was surprised.
I was going to go to our foreign policy expert in the center square.
They could calibrate the result to a minority Liberal in the first. Good job to them, because they're already doing better than all of the advocacy organizations, Yeah, I mean, listen, I think if you think
that was funny, Jordan. That was really funny that the notion that we want to reelect the Liberals, but only a minority. I mean, you're calibrating that from Beijing. That's pretty difficult to do. Yeah,
good for you. Yeah. But I think that speaks to a truth too. Like, some of this is bullshit, right? Like, this is bragging out of, the diplomatic, the Chinese diplomatic community take credit for things that they really had very little to do with, right? Like, that's obviously bullshit. So I think, that struck me, and that particular line being obviously a telling one. Did they have influence? Yes, absolutely. But I think what was surprising to me were two things. So first, this is a bad leak from CSIS. Let's also just say it is not good that this report found its way into the ever-enterprising Bob Fife's hands. That is bad because we share our intelligence with the Five Eyes, and it turns out our allies don't really like it if we're leaking like a sieve. So that's a problem that people, at CSIS and the government should be really attentive.
But that really shouldn't have been the government's first response, should it, Jordan?
No.
Can I jump in on that? Because I don't know what your guys' experience was with CSIS when you were in the PMO, but mine was it was yesterday's news tomorrow, and we got better intelligence from CNN than we ever got from CSIS. And, I think the failure and what that leak is about is, actually important intelligence not making its way up to decision makers. And so people within, CSIS and the intelligence community feeling they need to leak it to get it out. I'm not a conspiracy theorist that thinks that, the government got this and sat on it. I'm actually very much of the view that they didn't get it. And people within the intelligence community felt they had to leak it to the media to actually get it heard.
How would it not get up to the top, Kory? How would it not get up to the top?
Here's how I think, because this is sort of, what
in the 2003 leadership, Kory, in the 2003 leadership, we had a guy working on our campaign who was allegedly sleeping with a Chinese agent. And the clerk of the Privy Council called me about it directly. So how would the PMO not have known about this?
Because what intelligence actually makes it up to the center of power, in my experience, is very late. It's very edited. It's very whitewashed, and that's that was my experience. I don't know what your experience was. But anything that we got from the intelligence community, we could have got a day earlier from CNN in most cases. And, and I think this is part of a larger conversation about the failure of our intelligence community and how all of that works. Like, there's no equivalent of like Leon Panetta for people who watch Zero Dark 30, where you have like a political figure who's the head of the CIA. That's the way the US does it. There's no such equivalent in Canada. So you have a bureaucracy that sort of is very risk averse. And the intelligence community only wants to tell political leaders things that they know for sure, which is the exact opposite of what intelligence is actually supposed to be and is. Intelligence is supposed to be information that is not available in the market, that goes straight to decision makers so that they can have a slightly more informed set of facts or information when they make a decision. And it's always suspect. It's always with a discount. It's always with a risk probability. And, I think, how we do it in Canada is only things with zero, risk actually filter the way up to the top. And I think it's, it speaks to a much deeper, much larger problem that we have in how we do intelligence, which I think is, I don't know what CSIS budget is, like $9 billion or something, like whatever it is. A waste of fucking money as we do it right now. It should be information that goes much more quickly up to the top with a risk probability associated. And I think things like this that are really important often just get purged out. And I don't think they make their way to the top. Like, what I will say, what I think the government did wrong is I think they knew that there were reports on this. And they didn't disclose them. I don't think they were briefed. I actually believe the PMO on that, but I think they, should have made that known much sooner in this process. And I think that's where the failure is.
I just want to make one more point. Before, and I think to build on what Kory said, this is exactly the reason why it's really important that Canada get good intelligence from the Five Eyes, because we're not always doing a stellar job here. But I think in terms of the political response, what really struck me was effectively the shrug from Trudeau. And I think that while it is maybe known in expert circles that yes, interference happens. And
sorry, I know that you've been interrupted so many times, but I just, as my old historian role, I have to tell you that there was a book in the 1970s about his father called Shrug, Trudeau in Power.
Well, it's all coming full circle. But I don't think it's a good look. And I'll just say that because I think that even though there are folks who know that this type of interference may be routine, that this has happened before, that we do this, that others do this, and so on and so forth, all that being the case, for voters, this is not good. And this erodes people's confidence in the democratic system in, I think, a really dangerous way. And so when you have a situation where that is the charge that's been leveled, your opponent, in this case, Pierre Poilievre, is taking that and ratcheting it, right? And like really going hard on it around the credibility of the election. For Trudeau to come out and kind of say like, yeah, we knew this was happening and like, don't worry, it had no impact. I don't think it's a good response. I think he needs to look a little concerned about it and look as though they're doing something about it in order to address some of the concerns around institutional integrity.
But Scott, let's pick up where Jordan left off. It wasn't just that he blithely reassured us that none of this was impactful on the election campaign, which don't know whether he's in a position to know that or not, but that their real message was, we're going to find out where these leaks are coming from.
Right.
Doesn't the combination of those two things make it look more suspicious than less?
Possibly, probably. I think, let me come back to the political response, because wise or unwise, and probably unwise, I think it is a product of the dynamic we're arguing about. Like, I think the reaction of the center, whether they gave it enough thought, was heavily influenced, and by the Prime Minister, was heavily influenced by their assessment about what stood behind this news report about the CSIS report. And it conditioned them to be, oh, for Christ's sake, don't people see through this? And I think a couple things. I'd make a separate and distinct observation from what Kory has said about our intelligence apparatus. And I don't know that I'm willing to be quite as condemning and universal in that condemnation, but I do think there's a lot of institutional groupthink within that. And I think you get, and I think that that's where this story comes from. I think there is, I mean, first and foremost, let's obviously acknowledge that China has become far more aggressive in the past 15 years, particularly in the last 5, on a whole variety of fronts, purchasing up, strategic deposits around the world in terms of minerals, its ownership of large portions of Africa, on and on and on. Industrial espionage, obviously, its move into technology and all those. So there's a million different ways in which they're being more aggressive, and then it's even showing up in almost darn near hard power aggressiveness. In terms of the way they conduct diplomacy and the way they're even actually starting to use military assets and so forth. So that's all alarming and scary. And then second, I think we have to acknowledge that there are attempts to influence. And I'm not benign about that, but I think that we have to distinguish between that and effective influence over the elections. And I think what's lost here is, and I'm with Jordan 1,000%, most of the proof point around this sort of stuff is taken from the Consul General Tong out of Vancouver boasting about the effect. That's all fucking bullshit. That's just that Consul General trying to brag back to Beijing that they had results. I mean, that is all just blowing smoke. And so I look at this and I think, this is evidence of, we're going to leak this. We're going to show that there's this, it's a kind of you get this Curtis LeMay groupthink. My God, you're not taking this seriously, and we're going to put the boots to you guys, and it's a scheme to get liberals because you guys are nutless and all. And I just think we have to be very, very skeptical. And I ran into it, and I'll tell you when I ran into it was around the Maharar issue, when we suggested that we were going to introduce a public inquiry to get to the bottom of it, the judicial inquiry. And holy fuck, I got called into meetings with a table full of Curtis LeMays telling me about, I know you political guys are worried about your short-term politics, but you're in big boy pants territory now, and you better, and they want to make sure to their colleagues among Five Eyes, to the big brassy generals who wear medals on their chest in the United States, that they're just as tough on this shit as they are, and all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of chest puffing, and there's a lot of there's a lot of machismo, and there's a lot of bullshit. At the same time that there's truth here. Just let me finish for a sec, Kory, because I just want to say, so we have to, it's the truth of it is much more nuanced. None of that relieves the government of the obligation to take seriously and appear to be taking seriously the notion of the integrity of our elections. Even if they go, these fucking guys are just leaking this to try to play a game. This is, this report exists somewhere.
They're not leaking it to play a game. I think
they're trying to jam the government.
No. I think that leak is from a more junior level of the intelligence community.
Yeah.
Out of frustration of it not through normal channels actually getting up to where it should go. And I think that's what I'm pointing out in terms of the systematic failure within the intelligence community. Yes, we should take this seriously. But of the things that we should take seriously about China, I would put this, in the bottom third, because I don't think it's that impactful at the end of the day, despite the bragging of one diplomat. Like what I think we should be much more concerned about is infiltration of our universities, infiltration of government agencies, Chinese hacking, which is being pointed out again and again and again by our intelligence community, and nobody talks about. Like, look, we're, at best, China's a rival, far more likely an adversary, and they've been engaged in, spying and espionage in various ways for a long time. I think what they're doing on elections is obviously not good, but I would say minor and largely ineffectual. But the other stuff that they're doing, we should be much, much, much more concerned about. Okay. And what is the appropriate reaction? It's not to talk about, the leak from CSIS, that's not good. You don't want spies leaking to the media. Obviously that's, it's a bad spy who leaks to the media. But, what do I think is, a much bigger and more important thing that we could be doing is demarche that, embassy official, demarche the people who were involved, that we know were involved, send them home. make a point that if you're going to fuck around in elections and espionage, you're going home, which is, what I think is the appropriate response. Do something that's actually meaningful.
Who among us, when there's an urgent need for something, just likes to let it sit there unaddressed as the situation worsens? I mean, urgent is one of those words that sets off an internal alarm bell, yeah? If you listen to the show regularly, you already know that Canada has an urgent need for more shipping container capacity at the Port of Vancouver. Our sponsor, the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, has the right plan for building that capacity, and it's called Roberts Bank Terminal 2. Because not only is shipping container capacity on Canada's west coast running out, a new port terminal is also needed for the future of Canadian trade. Here's what I mean. Business and trade needs in our country are only growing. A new marine container terminal at the Port of Vancouver will support Canadian businesses, large and small, by linking them to the global economy. And just as critically, it strengthens our trade sovereignty, the ability to protect Canadian trade through our own domestic ports. Without more terminal capacity, our own businesses and trade partners will be forced to look to U.S. ports to get their products where they need to go. The inefficiencies and extra costs associated with that kind of situation are pretty obvious. Not to mention the blow to our national consciousness. So why is Roberts Bank Terminal 2 the solution? Because it'll bring urgently needed container capacity to support Canadian business, will keep well-paying jobs in Canada, and it's being led by the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, who has a proven track record of building sustainable infrastructure projects. And the Port Authority is a trusted partner of government, business, Indigenous groups, and local communities to get the job done. Jordan, if you were advising the government, what's the next thing they should do on this issue?
I think that they need to express some forward action on it. And, the policy solution or the policy response that's been raised is creating a registry of foreign agents in Canada. So that's something that exists in the US and some other countries. And look, they've talked about studying it. So fine, move that up, advance that, throw it to committee, whatever. Do something, make some gesture that you think that this is serious. Because I do think that there's a real danger in him just looking too blasé about this because he's purported to be the beneficiary of it, right?
I agree with all that. There's underpinning all of this, though. Take Kory's point, and Jordan's point. So if you say, well, there's a need for a correction in terms of political response to this specific story, no matter how skeptical I might be about what stands behind it substantively, no matter how much I might agree with Kory that where you really want to concentrate the focus of your China policy is on all these other aspects and threats. But the world hasn't figured out yet how to deal with those threats. That's the fucking problem, right? The world hasn't figured it out. And
That's not true.
No, but wait a second. Wait a second. Kory, hold on. Kory, hold on. Scott, we're talking politics here. You cannot come out and say, wow, you think that's important. That's not important. China's doing a million other worse things than that. Let's not talk about how they helped us get reelected. Let's talk about how they're fucking doing corporate espionage. You can't say that.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there's a necessary correction.
That FBI has raided, some of the pseudo Chinese police stations that are operating in the United States, and we know from our own, publicly disclosed facts from our intelligence community that we have them here too. The U.S. is actually taking steps to shut them down. Why aren't we doing that?
Well, hang on. Sorry, I'm making a different point. I agree with you guys. I agree with Jordan's point about should probably move on the foreign registry. I don't disagree with what you're suggesting too, Kory. And I think that the Prime Minister needs to kind of correct a shrugged-shouldered tone that seemed to be communicated. But what I am saying is that when it comes to more sweeping substantive response and pushback to China, yeah, they're making arrests on, foreign police stations, whatever. But I mean, what is the fundamental, how's the West going to tackle China? How do we not let this turn into a big fundamental new Cold War? On the other hand, how do you hem in their aggressiveness? And I don't think the smartest minds in the world have figured that out.
I don't know. You guys, we're pretty far afield now. We're pretty far afield now from a front page Globe story that said there was interference in our election campaign. Now you're talking about global geopolitics. This is an issue in this country. This will be an issue. China's fucking unpopular in Canada. And any country interfering in a Canadian election would be unpopular. And I don't think it is going to wear well if the government doesn't seem determined to get to the bottom of it.
But I don't understand we've responded to you on that, David.
Yeah,
we've
but
said
like,
take measures.
Yeah, take measures. But like I would also say, if we were to triage the problems with China and what we need to take action on, I would rank this near the bottom because I don't think it's actually effectual. Like I think it's dumb, it's ineffectual, it's minor. But what I do think is like very problematic is the PRC operating police stations within our country and going after their own citizens. I think it's, hacking is problematic. I think the larger espionage endeavors that are under are very problematic. I think the shock collar they put on Taiwan is very problematic and causing a lot of inflation here and damaging our economy, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of problems with China. This is obviously one of them. It shouldn't be blinked away, but I don't think I would put this at the center of the focus politically or policy wise. Like
So I have to conclude from all three. I have to conclude from all three of you that I'm wildly overblowing this as an issue, and that this really isn't very much of a political issue at all. Because all of you really want to talk about geopolitics. You don't want to talk about the politics of this issue.
But you're a campaign manager. Issue when Pierre Poilievre has like latched arms to this and is amping it up, right? Like that's to me. That's where the danger and the risk for the government really becomes acute, right?
Let's be very politically crass about it because, we all work in campaigns. How many ridings is there a large Chinese ex-national, population in? You're dealing with like about a half dozen ridings in the country where that is a major factor. It is not changing any election. What the PRC can do in, Blackstrap, Saskatchewan, not a fucking thing, right? As like most ridings. So
probably more than the Liberals can.
You've got about a half dozen ridings where this is an issue, and we shouldn't blink it away. We shouldn't dismiss it. It is actually a problem. It's all, I'm not trying to be dismissive about it. I'm just saying, the thought that the expat Chinese community is going to swing an election in Canada is in defiance of anyone who's ever been a campaign manager and looked at an ethnicity breakdown in ridings. It's not a fucking thing. All right. It's a thing in a handful of ridings. It's something we should be concerned about. It's something we should go after them on and be upset about for sure. But I'd be way more fucking upset about the hacking and the pseudo police stations and a whole bunch of other things that they're doing. And it's sort of sad that this is the big thing in the headlines, not the other things, which I think are way more problematic.
I'm saddened, David. I'm saddened that you think I'm only capable of offering a quick quip and off the top of my head rejoinder to some pure political tactical issue, as opposed to thinking deeply and carefully about geopolitics.
Yeah.
And
I'm so disinterested in your point of view about how to address China in the world. I can't even begin to fucking tell you.
Well, that's because you're in Florida.
All right. So we got 10 minutes left. And we wanted to talk about political resignations because there was a big one in Toronto over the last week. And I say over the last week because it took about a week for it to develop. But I don't want to talk about Tory and the Toronto mayoralty resignation because as a person from Saskatchewan, I think we've already talked about the Toronto mayoralty too much on this podcast already. But I do think it's interesting, and we all thought it was interesting to talk about resignations. We've all been around leaders who have had to make that decision. And it's kind of interesting to talk about the circumstances in which that happens. Who's involved? Who's consulted? What interests beside the leaders are you worried about and considering? And what are those factors? Scott, you suggested this topic. Do you want to lead us off?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, there's a couple of things. Two dynamics around resignations that I think are always interesting. First is, and you hinted at it even in your question, is that who is and who isn't involved in the decision? And the answer, of course, is it's porous and it varies. And what we witnessed actually this past week in Toronto with all these people coming forward and saying, actually, John Tory shouldn't resign, and whether that started to sway his thinking. I mean, that's not an atypical thing, when people are suddenly people who may not have your best interests at heart will start flushing in and saying, and you'll remember that when on 2006, during the day of the election, when we knew that we were going to lose, and that Festchuk and I locked ourselves in a hotel room with a bucket full of beer and wrote Paul's speech where he was going to acknowledge the loss and resign, he suddenly was being flooded with a bunch of people urging him to stay on, caucus members, all these people come out of it. And the thing that I would say is that I've witnessed over the years, time and again, the people who come forward in defiance of those who are closest to the leader, the family, the friends, the close and long-term advisors, people who genuinely stand to lose by having that person leave their post. All their access to power and privilege is going to be evaporated, but nevertheless, they're recommending that the leader step aside. And then you find these kind of hangers-on wandering into the conversation and saying, no, don't. They don't have a goddamn whit of concern about what's actually that person's best interest. So I'm always suspicious about, that outer ring, not the inner ring, the outer ring of people who are urging to stick around, because almost always they're voicing their concerns, not the best interest of the leader. The second thing is, don't be bitter, man. Like, there's nothing better and more delicious to watch, but it is a terrible thing to be part of, than a bitter resignation. Boris Johnson, when he resigned recently, he's bitching and moaning about how the herd will come for you, no acknowledgement of personal responsibility, right? All that sort of bitterness. My favorite, of course, is Nixon, with the farewell address to the White House, where he, almost an out-of-body experience, says, remember, don't hate those who hate you, because they don't win unless you hate them back, and then you destroy yourself. And you're like, is this a speech or a confession? What the fuck, man? And so...
Hell, you won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore.
Exactly. I'm not a crux.
Don't be bitter. Last thing I'll say is just one quick little story. When Paul did resign that day in 2006, and that was an unpleasant day at the end of a long time. The project of my entire adult life, along with yours, David, that day came to a conclusion, and that was difficult professionally, personally, and every other level. Paul was a savage guy to work for when it came to writing speeches and remarks. He loved to torture writers. He would dangle you over a flame. Let's restructure it. Let's change it. Why would you say that? Fuck, this is no good. You said this thought earlier. Now you repeat this thought. Nobody repeats a thought twice in a speech. Don't you know anything about structure? Just kick the living shit out of you. The beatings, we call them, and on and on. On this most consequential of days, when Paul was resigning as prime minister and leader of the party, Festchuk and I sat in that room. We wrote that resignation speech. We brought it into him. He made 2 modest wording changes and handed it back. The gravity of the moment, the weight of it all. In that moment, he didn't give a shit about what the syllables were. He understood what the message was. And that, more than anything, upset me that day, because I thought to myself, this is such a variation from character. He's so absorbing this moment. He's so taking it in that he doesn't even have the energy, the wit, or the interest to beat me up about the paragraphs. And that affected me immensely.
Hey, Scott, are you paying attention? Are you paying attention to all these chains of people talking about their dialogue with artificial intelligence, whether it be ChatGPT or Bing, and they're having these? Can you imagine if Paul had been having those speech dialogues with ChatGPT and giving his feedback to that? What would ultimately have come out of that?
It would have been a master class in cursing.
Well, can I go next? Because
Yeah.
I want to jump in on that last point, because I've worked with a ton of speechwriters over the years, including a little bit with even Scott Reid, if I may say so. And Scott, you are one of the most talented writers and speechwriters I've ever worked with. And so the fact that Paul was like, adding you, I don't know. I'm not saying that reflects well on his understanding of what makes a good speech. But
You taught me.
Structure. You don't understand structure, Kory.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. I think there are 2 kinds of resignations. There are those that are imposed, which is everyone below the leader. So John Tory decided to leave, right? That was his decision. Paul Martin decided to leave. When Stephen Harper resigned from leadership, he decided to leave. there are a lot of other people who don't really decide they're leaving, and their resignations are basically foisted upon them. But, what I think, the one that I wanted to, because we were supposed to think about, good and bad and all of that, the one that I wanted to go to, you'll be shocked to hear it's from Saskatchewan, is actually Brad Wall. And why I wanted to single that one out is he didn't lose an election. He left at like 70% popularity. He could have been easily reelected.
The rare boxer who quits with his brain still intact.
Right, but that is so exceptionally rare in this business, and I want to highlight that one because it's so fucking rare. But most people who resign, it's foisted upon them, and even sometimes in leadership positions, like. What I would say about the John Tory thing is if it doesn't add up, it's because you're missing part of the equation. And I don't know what the missing part is, but I do know this. If people like Deb Hutton and Nick Cavalis, who have got more intestinal fortitude and issues management experience than virtually anyone I know in politics, say you got to go, then you got to fucking go. Like it's I don't want to go down the road of various things that they've managed their way through in the past, but let's put it this way: they're not shy about a fight. And if people like that are saying you got to go, and people sitting on the sidelines with all the information are saying, oh no, you can survive it. Well, do you really know? Do you really know all the facts? I don't know all the facts, but I'm willing to, on that basis, say you probably have to go.
Yeah,
Jordan.
Well, on the topic of resignations, I lived through Tom's resignation, which was the longest resignation I think in modern political history. And I think it definitely.
Well, actually, Scott and I might have something to say about that.
Longer? I don't know. It was like 18 months. It was long. Anyways, and the point is, long is not good.
Yeah.
So, if it is much better to write your own end cleanly. And the longer you stay, the harder that becomes, because everybody can, regardless of their feelings, can find it in themselves to be gracious for a few weeks, but when you start to extend that period into months, that becomes harder. And I think, watching what was unfolding with the Tory, should he have done it or not have done it this week, and just how it becomes messy, I think that's one of the biggest lessons on resignations. Cut it cleanly and do it under your own control. And I think, if you want to look at kind of a contrasting example, somebody who did it really, really well, John Horgan comes to mind. Obviously, that was forced in a different way because of health issues, but, he left on a high. He left, at a time of his own choosing, and he got to really write his own exit. And I do think it matters. It matters how you leave, right? Being gracious, owning your mistakes, and setting the table for your successor are all really important things that go to how you will be remembered in that role. And that's something that I think can be really, really difficult in the moment, especially if it's not a resignation that your principal went to willingly.
Can I just jump in and say, I think that Mulcair leaving is the biggest unforced error that the NDP has committed in the last 20 years. Like, I think it was phenomenally stupid. And I think it led to them basically having the seats that they have. I don't get it. I don't understand it. I think it was a giant fucking mistake.
Well, I think we need another episode.
You just became the hanger-on that's lecturing Deb and Nick that you complained about.
Yeah. I mean, Kory, like, as you know, the circle if the principal doesn't like the answer, the circle gets wider. So, it would be possible at some point that perhaps he might have galled you. But I think that, we can and should have a whole episode about that. But the, the membership of the NDP elected Tom for a really specific job description, right? And that was to hold Quebec. And when that didn't happen, that turned, and I think For compared to a lot of New Democrats, I think I have a pretty nuanced view on Tom's leadership, and I think he does, he did bring some considerable strengths. But at the end of the day, the basis upon which he was elected was pretty clear and sort of wrote the ending.
The good examples of resignations that you both used are people that resigned while they were unpressured to. Nobody has ever voluntarily resigned the Prime Ministership of Canada. Why do you think that is? Nobody's ever gone out on top.
Hubris.
You always think you can have one more.
Right.
It's partly hubris. I think it's also partly a reflection that the people that are capable of competing successfully for that office, the psychology that they envelop, the determination that they acquire, all of it qualifies you for a sort of survival that's improbable and that does not allow for a careful, objective consideration of your own resignation unless it's forced. It's almost the qualities that get you there are the qualities that ensure you can't leave unless marched.
Sure. Okay, we've burned through a whole hour here, so let's get to our hey yous.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The hey yous are about to begin.
Jordan, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. My hey you is going out to Doug Ford. Please get the fuck out of Toronto politics. Nobody wants you there. Nobody cares about your opinion on the mayor, and you should stop talking about it.
All right.
I second that.
I wonder if that had the feeling of a memo that had been handed privately to him.
So
also,
listen, you found the place where the left and the right touch.
I'll stick with Ontario.
Oh, you're going to go, Scott? You go ahead.
Well, I'll just pick up on that because it says I stick with the theme of beating up on Doug Ford and his cabinet. My hey yous to Sylvia Jones. It's not going to have any political consequence or fallout. It's not going to be of lingering note for all the reasons we talked about out of the Royal Commission. But listen, at a time when the country was faced with crisis and governments and police forces were called to act objectively, look beyond themselves and work together, her text to Marco Mendicino or her federal counterpart, I think, really sort of, tombstones itself as the edifying thought. You're not my fucking boss. Well, we're your fucking boss, Sylvia Jones, and you should have done your job and you didn't. So, hey, you, shitty job and shitty manner and shitty reasons for not doing your job.
Jesus, Kory, people are mean today. What do you got?
Woof. I was going to say something nice. I almost feel like I should respond to that and change my hey you because I think that's total bullshit. But I'm going to just say something nice. I was going to do my hey you to Steve Outhouse, who I think took a huge risk to go and be the campaign manager out in Alberta for Danielle Smith at a time when she was down in the polls and everyone thought she was on a one-way track to oblivion. And I think he's doing a fucking hell of a job. And so, hey, Steve, good work. Keep it up.
Excellent. Okay. I have a nice one too. My hey you goes out to Peter Herndorf, who passed away over the weekend. And many people have commented on this, and many people are more qualified than I to discuss his contribution to the Canadian arts and culture scene, whether it's at the CBC or TVO or the National Arts Centre, all of which were amazing. But I just have a personal comment, which is in the 1990s and early 2000s, when I was sort of a young and fairly insecure and unsure of myself, political advisor who wasn't sure if I belonged in the big leagues where I was playing, Peter Herndorf out of nowhere took an interest in me just at a personal level and would seek me out for lunch and talk to me and send me clippings and send me notes of encouragement. And it meant the goddamn world to me. And I had no idea why he did it, but I got the sense reading Twitter and things like that he'd done it to a lot of people. And so to a tremendous guy who made a hell of a contribution to Canada and quite a contribution to me, hey, you, Peter Herndorf. All right. I would like to thank you three for bringing the fucking fire today to this conversation. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Telus, our sponsors, CN and the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. I'd like to thank all of you who listened or watched today, and of course, my childhood friends, Gumpy and Pokey. Until next week, we'll have more Curse of Politics. See you then.